In the United States, there are 423 national park sites as part of the national park system, with the amassed total of 63 national parks. Now, according to the National Association of State Foresters, 60% of America's forest land is privately owned. However, 10% is owned by state and local municipalities, and 30% is owned by the federal government. 30%. That's 238 million acres of forest land, with the National Park Service and Department of Defense managing 55 million of those acres. This all started with Yellowstone National Park back in 1872, right after the first organized expedition into Yellowstone in 1870. Ulysses S. Grant was the one who signed the bill to establish Yellowstone as the first national park, which the U.S. Army managed from 1886 to 1918. 2 million acres of land snatched up just like that, for the preservation of the land for future generations to enjoy. And that is all fine and dandy, but what about the restricted areas? How can future generations enjoy a place they can't go into? So I want to take a moment to explore the theories and secrets that may be hidden within the restricted areas of national parks. Why are they trying to keep the public out of certain areas? Or I guess the more interesting question would be, what are they trying to keep in? So the first thing I want to do is tell you all the truth. There are very few people, particularly in the US, that live in the wilderness. I'm not talking about places that you can see driving by in your car. I'm talking about the deep wild, the deep forest. When humans come into these places, they tend to make a clearing because, for one, people need to build shelters, and another thing, you can't just go and live with a bunch of buffalo, bison, moose, wolves, bears, jaguars, mountain lions, alligators. You can't just go live among these creatures. You have to do what they do and create a territory and habitat for your own survival. Now, even when people go into the wilderness to camp, they build fires and sometimes leave a mess behind them and maybe some trash that wouldn't be there otherwise. So the fear is that if people are just allowed to roam freely and do whatever they want, anywhere they want, then every place would be terraformed and ruined. See, humans have dominion over the plants and animals here on Earth, and so it is our responsibility to maintain that. Mainly because we have the power to destroy it. So, long before the National Park Service was created, some 40 years prior to that, we had protection acts in place for national preserves, historical parks, lakes, to preserve their historical, their geological and cultural features, as well as to preserve the wildlife there. On May 10th, 1916, Representative William Kent introduced H.R. 15522 to establish a National Park Service. President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law on August 25, 1916. The legislation created in the Department of the Interior a service to be called the National Park Service. It stated that the National Park Service, NPS, shall promote and regulate the use of the federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations, to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. This right here explains why the National Park Service's primary mission has been conservation, in such a way that it punishes more than it protects. Back in the 1930s, for about 30 years, the NPS has had a reputation for violating that mandate of preservation. For example, they would consistently manipulate the wildlife populations. Bison and elk were shot all the time, trapped and shipped to other locations. See, not only did they not want humans to ruin the scenery, they didn't want the wildlife to ruin the scenery either. They didn't want deer trampling all over the grass and vegetation, a crime that may have been punishable by death for hoofed animals, by the way. So that should give you all a good idea of what the NPS does all day. In certain areas of these parks, deep in the wild, there are places no one can get to. You can't drive there, you can't use a bike, you can't use aircraft to get there, and it is almost impossible to hike into many of these places, which some are hidden paradises. Some they don't want anyone to even look at, because they don't want the word to get out. They absolutely do not want people to know some of these places exist. But somehow they are for future generations to enjoy? Who? The survivors of this collapsing world? That would make these parks reserves, not preserves. At the federal level, when you have the military, such as the U.S. Army, managing some of these sites, of course they are probably missile silos, weapon stores, bases, bunkers, the works. And of course they don't want us to know about those things, even though they don't deny that they use areas like that for defense purposes. Now, when it comes to the secrecy or conspiracy theories behind what is kept within restricted areas, I can tell you that in many of these locations, they are hiding ruins. The reason is because they don't want all these people traveling in from around the world to explore them. They have already unofficially explored them and have already extracted everything that they have needed from them. And many of those ruins happen to be pyramids. And you have to understand that if people were allowed to explore these places, that would lend toward rewriting history. So, what about creatures? You know, there was a story about this deer hunter. And this hunter was camped out somewhere remote in the wild, right? And one night, he woke up to something scratching on his tent. Of course, he is thinking it's some animal, until the thing pressed its human-like face against the side of the tent. Looking at the impression, he could make out the human features, which spooked him enough to cause him to panic and to kick at it. He grabbed his gun, and when he exited the tent, he fired a couple of warning shots. But the creature was behind him. Now, the hunter said that this person didn't have any human skin. Instead, it had something that was like raw meat with a lot of hair. He said the face was lumpy and lopsided. And something else surprising was how this creature mimicked the sound of the gun and the zipper of the tent opening before the creature ran off into the forest. So, I believe I mentioned this before in a presentation I did on the wild man. And the idea here is that there is a boundary set between us and a population of a different type of human living in small colonies. Then there is the giant monster containment theory, right? That the government has knowledge of some very large creatures and have fenced off certain areas to keep them contained. But it doesn't have to be a physical fence. They can simply keep you and I out of the area that these creatures live and traverse in. Instead, they use the natural boundaries to separate us. In some cases, you have to climb through small tunnels or holes to get into some of these pristine paradise environments that exist. Aside from that, there are other phenomena and anomalies that exist deep in these forests, right? Magnetic anomalies. There are areas on the planet where physics change. It's one of the reasons craft are not allowed to fly over these areas. There are places that have a psychological effect on people. There is the harsh terrain and potentially dangerous wildlife. Sometimes you have these hidden gorges or these big holes covered up by brush. So you try walking through that thick brush thinking there is level ground in front of you, and in a few steps you take a 40-foot drop into a large crater. If you somehow survive that, you will probably just end up something's lunch. I mean, if you are in some of these forests, there is probably something always hunting you, stalking you. The spiritual or haunting energy in some of these forests, not just in the US but around the world, are on record about how creepy they are. Now, there is another theory that isn't really discussed or talked about that often, and that is the cabin in the woods theory. There is the sci-fi cabin in the woods, like in the movie, which would be a cabin or a facility or laboratory for some crazy experimentation that wouldn't be allowed outside of the veil of the wilderness. And then there is the more sinister cabin in the woods, the one that actually exists, where certain people go to do their evil. Did you guys know that if you took a map of the US where there are clusters of missing children, there are also national parks? And that is probably the worst case scenario here, as people can coexist with other beasts. We just don't like having to coexist with evil. There is more to come, more to explore, so stay tuned. Be sure to visit woodwardentertainment.com and the Woodward Entertainment Store. You can follow me on Instagram at JAEWoodward. That's all for now. Everyone enjoy your evening as the madness out there continues. Stay awake, stay aware, stay safe. Take care, guys, and I'll talk to you all soon.